Before we start with discussing about the theory behind Spring MVC, we would start setting up a Spring MVC web application. We would want to be really hands-on, so we would try and set it up and then understand the theory behind it. The objective of this step is to configure the application to use Spring MVC. The web application which we already have, we want to enhance it to use Spring MVC. We would call this step 11 because we reserve numbers 1 to 10 for learning the basic web application. So the steps which we would be using during this course would run from step 11 to step 36 or more than that. So those would be the 25 steps. So when we say step 11, it's actually probably in the real sequence it's step 1. We would still refer it to as step 11. Now we are in step 11, and in this step we would want to configure the application to use Spring MVC. First thing is we would want to be able to download the jars. We would want to download the Spring MVC jars and have them ready. Who would do that for us? We would use Maven to do that. So that's the mini step 2 in here. So we would have Maven download the Spring MVC jars for us. Spring MVC uses a front controller pattern. We'll discuss about a front controller pattern during the theory part of this particular step. Spring MVC uses front controller pattern, which is the dispatcher servlet. What we would need to do is, as with any servlet, you'd want to configure that in your web.xml. That's the next mini step. We'll add the dispatcher servlet to the web.xml. And because we are using Spring, we would want to create an application context, a Spring application context. A Spring application context needs a XML. So that's the fourth mini step that we would be doing. That's to create a simple Spring configuration XML. So that is the summary. We would start with adding the jars, add a dispatcher servlet, and then we would add the Spring application context. It's very simple, and let's get started with it mini step by mini step. Before we start with the mini steps, I would want to do a little bit of refactoring. I'm a great believer in keeping the code as clean as possible after each step. And the fact that we have a package named as web app in the source main Java does not make me happy. So what I'll do is I'll start with refactoring it. So I'll say right click, refactor, rename, and I would give the name com.in28 minutes. This package contains the code for Java EE. So that's JEE servlets. So I'll call it JEE. So com in 28 minutes JEE, and press OK. We can now run this application in Tomcat and test if it's working fine. Right click, run as maven build tomcat 7 colon run. So it's tomcat 7 colon run, and click run. This would launch up the server. Maven is doing a lot of things in the background. The reason why we use Maven is because Maven makes it very easy to manage dependencies. Maven also builds the var for us, and Maven is also deploying the var in Tomcat. During one of the mini steps in a subsequent step, we would discuss the power of Maven in detail. For now, the important thing for you is running tomcat 7 colon run, and it's launching up the web application. The web application is coming up. The URL to use is printed in here. It's http://localhost 8080. So I can copy it from here, and now you can see that it's completed starting up. So it's ready. Because it's the first time I'm running this application after a long time, it's taking quite some time to start up. But usually this startup would take less than half a minute. I'll type in the URL and go to localhost 8080. Password to use is in the file called login service. So it's in 28 minutes, and password is dummy, DUMMY. It's a funny password, and it comes up with welcome in 28 minutes. So the application is running fine. So let's get going with adding our Spring stuff in. One of the things we would need to look out for is we would want to add the Spring MVC jars. So before we add in the Spring MVC jars, I'll want to check what's there in the libraries path right now. So if you look at the libraries, Maven dependencies, the only thing which is there is Java EE6. We are developing a Java JEE6 web application. So the specification that we are developing this web application to is JEE6. And therefore, what we have done is we have a dependency on Java EE6. So we have a jar already specified in here, Java EE Web API. So Java EE Web API defines the JEE, and we are saying 6.0, so JEE6. So JEE6 defines how you should create a servlet, how your JSP should be. All the standards are part of JEE6, and we have an API jar of that already in the dependencies. That's the only dependency that we have right now. That's the only jar that we are using. When we are in a POM and I am talking about a dependency, it's basically a jar file. So that's the only dependency that we are using until now. But now we would want to add a dependency on to Spring MVC, because we want to make use of Spring MVC, so we have to add a dependency on Spring MVC. So you can open up the pom.xml and add in the dependency to Spring MVC. Dependency to Spring MVC is in the useful snippets for step 11. As we discussed, we are in step 11, and if you go in the useful snippets section in the pom.xml, there is a dependency to Spring Web MVC. If you don't want to use these snippets, and if you were doing this for some other jar, you want to find out what's the Maven dependency to use, then all that you need to do is type in Spring MVC dependency or Maven dependency on Google, and one of the first results usually would contain the dependency to the Spring Web MVC. You can see that there is a 4.2.4 release which is there after that, but I would want to use the 4.2.3. So you can go here, copy the dependency from here, and you would be all set. So this is one way you can do that. I made it easier for you by putting a snippet already available. So we are going to use 4.2.2.release actually. So I'll use that. Basically, now you can see what would happen. So in the dependencies right now, you can see Maven dependencies. The only thing which is present is Java EE Web API 6.jar. Now I've added it in. I'm not saved the file yet, so I'll save it now. So I'm saving it. You'd see that Eclipse would do a magic right now. So it would build the workspace, and once the building of the workspace is complete, you'd see that there are a couple of new dependencies that would be added in there. So you would see that now we have a lot of dependencies in here. How do they come in? What we have added in is a dependency on Spring Web MVC. So Spring Web MVC is what we have added in. So this is what we have added in. The other dependencies are called transitive dependencies. Actually, if you want to run any web application using Spring MVC, then you need all the jars which are present in here, because we need Spring MVC, and Spring MVC internally it needs Spring. So it needs all the things which are related to Spring. It makes use of AOP, so it needs this particular jar, and it has logging. It does logging using commons logging, so it needs this jar as well. So we added in the dependency to Spring MVC, and if you press Control and click this, you can open up the pom.xml for Spring MVC as well. And then you can see what are the dependencies for Spring MVC. You would see that there are a lot of dependencies that it has, and some of those are what are downloaded in here. If you're not understanding this fully, that's not a problem at all. So basically what we are doing in here is, instead of going and downloading each of these jars manually, what we made Maven do is to download them all for us. We did that by adding a very simple configuration in the pom.xml. This is called configuration of a dependency, and to configure a dependency, we give a group ID, artifact ID, and a version. The version which we are going to use is 4.2.do.release, and the jar which we are making use of is Spring Web MVC. That's basically the Spring MVC main jar. So that's the second mini step done. So we have refactored the package name. We have added the dependency to Spring. The next step is to configure the dispatcher servlet. So basically, Spring uses this pattern. Spring MVC uses this pattern called front controller. A front controller is basically something where all the requests, so whenever I come from a browser to a web application, all the requests would first go to this controller. So anything would first go to the dispatcher servlet, and only then the dispatcher servlet would send it to a controller or a JSP or anything else. This pattern is called a front controller pattern. We will discuss a little bit more about the front controller pattern in the theory section. Let's now go to the web.xml. So I'll open up the web.xml. Control Shift R is the shortcut. I'm using Control Shift R and I typed in web.xml. The other way would have been to manually go there. So main, web app, web.inf, web.xml. Control M maximizes the whole thing. So now I can see the web.xml. It's a very simple thing. We want to add the dispatcher servlet to this particular web.xml. If you have already worked with servlets, you know that any servlet that you want to use, you should either add it to the dispatcher servlet or you should be using an annotation based approach. Over here, what we'll do is we'll add dispatcher servlet manually to the web.xml. How do you add a dispatcher servlet? Again, we have it ready for you. In the web.xml, the dispatcher servlet configuration, you would find it in the snippets. It's a very simple configuration. If you have already developed a web application, you'd know that this particular thing is quite this is exactly the way you define any servlet. So what I'm doing is I'm saying a servlet name. I'm calling it dispatcher. You could call it anything, to do servlet or anything. That's not really important. So I'm calling it dispatcher. So that's the name I'm giving it. The class is important because class is the exact thing that you would want to use. So this dispatcher servlet, if you click on it, it's defined in the Spring framework. So this is the dispatcher servlet, which is coming from the Spring MVC jar that we have added in. And you can see a big set of comments in here about the dispatcher servlet. Let's not really go into it right now. So we have a dispatcher servlet class, and the servlet name is dispatcher. And one of the configurations that dispatcher servlet needs is where is the configuration for the dispatcher servlet? Where is the Spring context configuration? Where is the Spring context? So that's the path that we are defining in here, which is web.inf to do servlet.xml. We have not created this yet. We'll create that very soon. So those are the three important things. So we configured a small servlet called dispatcher, and we are mapping all requests which start with Spring MVC. So what we want to do is whenever user types in a URL, Spring MVC / we want it to go to this particular servlet mapping. So that's why we are giving it a servlet mapping Spring-MVC. So when we type in localhost 8080 / Spring MVC, the control goes to this dispatcher servlet. So what we have done until now is first we refactored, second is we added in the Spring jars, third is we have added in the dispatcher servlet in the web.xml. To add the dispatcher servlet in the web.xml, we need a couple of important things. One is where is the Spring context for dispatcher servlet? So where is the configuration of all the Spring stuff? It's in to do servlet.xml, which is not yet there. That's not a problem. And the second thing is what is the URL you want to map to dispatcher servlet? The URL which we mapped is Spring-MVC. Those are the two important things as far as dispatcher servlet is concerned. And there is one last step which is preventing us from running this web application. That's the to-do servlet.xml. So let's quickly create this to-do servlet.xml also. Let's create XML, right click, new, other XML file. We want to call this, let's be safe, to-do -servlet.xml, and I click next. You just go ahead and say finish. And whatever it comes up with is not really important because we have the complete to-do servlet.xml, a simple example in here. There is the XSD that we adhere to, which is defined by Spring. Other than that, the configuration in the to-do servlet.xml is very, very simple. So what we are doing is something called a component scan. So the component scan we would discuss very soon. And other than that, there's very little in this particular file as well. So now we have followed the 4 mini steps. So what we have done until now is we have renamed the package. That was to make sure that the code is well formatted. We added the Spring jars in, and then we added the dispatcher servlet to web.xml. But we saw that dispatcher servlet needed a configuration of the Spring context XML, and we created a Spring context XML as well. So those are all the things that you would need to be able to run this Spring MVC application. So let's go ahead and see if we are able to bring the server up. What you see is I'm getting an address already in use. That's because I already have the server up and running. So let me kill this fast, and I'll also kill this particular server which was already running, and I'll click this button to put everything out. Yep, and I'll do that again. The way you can do a previous step again is by using this as well. So let's quickly kick it off from here, and you'd see that the Tomcat 7:run, which we did it in a different way earlier, this is another way to do that. So you just need to take this, click this small arrow in here, and you can take the last thing, because that would be the last thing which would have done. So now you'd see that it's starting up. I mean, the Tomcat server is starting up, and you can see the most important part in here is that servlet dispatcher initialization completed in some milliseconds, so about a second time. So this is the Spring MVC servlet that we wanted to start up, and you can see that there are no errors in starting it up. So that's perfect. So what we have now is the Spring MVC framework is up and running in Tomcat. So we used Maven to configure the dependencies for Spring, and we configured the dispatcher servlet and a sample Spring application context. There are a lot of things that we did in this step which probably you would not understand completely. Probably this is the last step where we would be doing things without understanding them completely. Give us some time, and over the course of the next couple of theory classes, we would understand everything about what we have done in this particular step in detail. Until then, bye-bye.